afternoon. Welcome. My name is Monica Murray, and I am the Public Programming Officer at the New York City Department of Records and Information Services, also known as DORIS. DORIS houses the city's municipal archives and library and is focused on fostering civic life by preserving and providing access to the historical and contemporary records of the New York City government and its people. I'll begin by introducing today's speaker. Riah Lee Kinsey is a Black queer scholar, archivist, and educator trained at the University of Delaware and the City University of New York. They are currently the public programs manager at Lefferts Historical House in Prospect Park, Brooklyn, New York. Kinsey's interests include Black and queer historical subjects, reparative museum and archival practice, and the material culture of the enslaved. As someone who has often struggled to find traces of themselves in traditional histories, Riah is dedicated both to showing the expansiveness of what is possible to recover about the past and reminding themselves and others that merely being present to continue the search is proof enough of the enduring legacies of all marginalized people. And now I'll turn it over to Riah to begin the presentation.
Hi, everyone. Let me just start sharing my screen. Let me know if you have any issues. Can everyone see?
Yes.
Awesome. Great. Oops, let me go back. So I do have some notes prepared for the first part of the presentation. The latter part is going to be a little bit more of a sort of fast and loose sharing of in-process research. So yeah, if there's anything that I'm not being super clear about, if you have any questions, definitely ask at the end and I would be happy to answer. In June of 1836, a 33-year-old Black woman named Mary Jones was arrested for pickpocketing a white male client following a paid sexual encounter. While searching Mary's person for the stolen items, police found Mary's anatomy incongruent with her gender presentation. She was at this point recognized as the heretofore never captured masquerading thief, Peter Sawali. It is important to note that cross-dressing in a criminal context would not have been entirely unfamiliar to these officials. While wearing clothing incongruent with one's anatomy was not yet illegal in 1830s New York, it was a strategy frequently deployed by a variety of lawbreakers in order to avoid detection by law enforcement. When Mary was interviewed by court officials during her arraignment, it is likely that their inquiries as to her legal sex and mode of dress were informed by this reality. The reasoning Mary provided in response, however, was far beyond their familiarity. Almost 200 years later, those studying Mary's testimony remain at a loss for how to make sense of this 19th century Black individual whose open expression of femininity puts her at odds with even some of the most expansive understandings of antebellum life. My work attempts to address this tension. In the court proceedings and tabloid coverage that constitute the documentary record of Mary's 1836 case, the focus is largely her otherness. Previous scholars have located the primary basis of this portrayal in sexual and racial difference, attributing her depiction to anxieties within mainstream white antebellum culture surrounding queer masculinity and Blackness. Recently, misogynoir has proven an important framework for understanding the negative representations of Mary in records. But I always felt like there was more to Mary than her otherness. In reading about the violence she faced during her 1836 trial, where onlookers mocked her stylish feminine attire and stripped her of her wig, I thought about similar experiences faced by my Black trans feminine peers. I wondered if Mary, too, had a network of friends and allies to commiserate with. As a Black trans, non-conforming person myself, it suddenly didn't feel as important to me to narrow down which of the myriad of differences between themselves and Mary that onlookers were drawing upon to justify their behavior. Instead, I wanted to know, if Mary was so universally seen as aberrant, who made her dresses? Who did her hair? Who taught her how to pickpocket as a woman? How did she know how to make or where to procure her infamous genital prosthetic? These questions, born of my own experiences, form the basis of my approach to the documentary record of Mary's life. Approaching trans identity as an interpretive or investigatory framework is something that many historical scholars are currently articulating. These scholars are, unsurprisingly, often transgender themselves. I personally find resonance in Jamie Pearson's Transmisogyny in the Colonial Archive, Remembering Transfeminine Life and Death in New Spain, 1604 to 1821. In this 2023 article, Jess Pearson talks about following in the footsteps of trailblazing transfeminine historians such as Salish Wesley, Susan Stryker, Jules Gill Peterson, and Gabrielle M.W. Bukowski in taking seriously her embodied and lived experiences as a trans woman, through which she has been able to notice and investigate elements of oft-told stories, from self-declarations of womanhood to acts of trans sisterhood that have been overlooked by those before her. As a Black trans person, I know from firsthand experience that while gender identity is internal and doesn't need to be publicly expressed to be true or real, to move in society openly expressing one's gender in the way that Mary Jones did takes some form of community support. This is what makes Mary's testimony so fascinating. As archival access and awareness of trans identities expand, further examples of Black trans Americans will no doubt be found. The one cited here by scholar Caitlin G.D. Hopkins is just one amazing example. That said, I believe that Mary's case will continue to stand out because the records of her life speak not only to the presence of individual Black trans people in American history, but to the possibilities of Black trans culture and communal knowledge. To explain how I've come to this conclusion, allow me to share some of the documents I've been lucky enough to surface about Mary's life following her 1836 arrest. Court records indicate that after Mary was tried and convicted for grand larceny, she was sentenced to 5 years hard labor in Sing Sing State Prison. This would mean that her date of release was around June 1841. Just 6 months later, on New Year's Eve of 1841, we see Mary being arrested again. This was the first of 16 known arrests between Mary's release from Sing Sing in June of 1841 and the last known mention of her in the press in April 1858. Most of the charges Mary faced during this period were for low-level offenses, including disorderly conduct and vagrancy, meaning that Mary probably served multiple 6-month to 1-year terms in Bridewell Penitentiary, in addition to her 2 known 5-year terms in Sing Sing State Prison, one in 1836 and the other in 1848. Both of those are mentioned in my blog post. The records show at least one semi-successful escape from imprisonment. Mary spent a large portion of the 1840s behind bars. Often, almost as soon as she was released, she would be recognized and rearrested. The rapid pace of arrests and confinements was likely influenced by New York State's criminalization of masquerading in 1845. Passed in response to ongoing riots throughout the state, the 1845 statute addressed incidents in which white male insurrectionists sought to conceal their identities by dressing as quote unquote Indians and as women. The first anti-masquerade law in the US, it criminalized disguises on public streets, as well as mass gatherings in places like bars and eating houses. It also enabled police to arrest disguised individuals on site. For Mary, this meant that the simple act of wearing feminine attire was now enough to put her in jail. At 5 foot 5 inches tall, with a thoroughly feminine voice and overall demeanor, Mary's anatomical sex was not immediately recognized by onlookers. Records indicate that Mary frequently dressed in the latest fashions and passed as a woman in her late 20s when she was nearly 50. There was one group of people predisposed to interpret Mary's attire as a disguise, however. Unfortunately for Mary, that group was her local police. These men would have already been suspicious of women, and especially Black women, in public, alone at night. Knowing Mary's story from peers and from the tabloids, they may have employed extra scrutiny to these women, noting characteristics such as evidence of depilation or false hair that otherwise would have been overlooked. So why do we find Mary frequenting the same areas where law enforcement had clearly come to recognize her? Why did she not move elsewhere where she was less likely to be outed? When every choice of hers from where to go to what to wear meant facing violence and imprisonment, it makes sense to operate on the assumption that there was some logic shaping those choices. What experiences shaped this logic? Intuition tells me that perhaps the answer is simple. The spaces in which Mary lived and worked were likely ones in which her identity was affirmed by her peers. But who were these peers? What made them more accepting than, say, the police officers who seemed to have had it out for Mary, or the onlookers at court who hurled abuse at her? In exploring these questions, I was especially curious about the people of her own color who Mary references in her 1836 testimony. Were these biological or chosen family? Was their particular openness to Mary's gender presentation emblematic of the urban landscape or something more nuanced, something specific to certain sectors of the Black community during this time? If these were chosen family, where and how did Mary encounter them? Were they replacements for an unaccepting biological family, as is the case for many trans people today? Or was Mary isolated from her biological family for other reasons, such as enslavement or forced migration? So these are the end of my written notes. From here on in, it's probably going to get a little chaotic, but I did want to explain some of the thinking behind what you're going to see next, which is the sort of in-process research. This particular map is a map depicting locations mentioned in Mary Jones's arrest coverage. The articles that I have in the previous slides, most of them do give information as to an address or a location where Mary either lived or was found occupying at the time of her arrest. So in this area here, I hope you can see my cursor. This is 108 Green Street, where in 1836, Mary lived and worked. That's part of the documentary record for that 1836 grand larceny case. 72 Sullivan Street is where she claimed to be living in 1848 when she's arrested again for grand larceny. This time she was pickpocketing another white male client. And you can see that they are very close to each other. She basically just moved a couple of streets over. This, I believe, is West Broadway. It used to be called, I believe, Chapel Street. So in that 1858 article, the last known mention of Mary Jones in the press, it says that her associate, Bill Thompson, he had a panel house or a, I guess the equivalent would be a bar slash brothel in which people were known to be robbed. And that was supposed to be at the intersection of Chapel and Chambers. So I also was able to look into Bill or William Thompson and find that in the 1840s, he was indeed living in a boarding house at 129 Chambers Street, which is right near that intersection. 114 Warren Street, that is another sort of like bar, eating place, bawdy house that Mary was involved with. She was arrested here in that 1841 case, her first known arrest post release for that 1836 grand larceny case. And again, you see that proximity of these two spaces. So what's now West Broadway, she was arrested all along West Broadway. That's frequently mentioned in a lot of the press coverage for her arrests. And another space was Fulton Street. She was also arrested in Fulton Street. So again, this is pretty interesting to me. It's basically like a straight line, and it goes past, the waterfront, which is well known as this area where sex workers would go in order to ply their trade. Also City Hall Park, much beloved by the archives, that was actually known during the time period in antebellum New York as an area where sex workers would be working. Particularly, it was associated with queer sex workers, and also a space in which a lot of queer public sex took place. So that's definitely a very interesting connection. So this article is something I located when I started thinking about locations and proximities. And I wondered, like, okay, who else is living at 108 Green Street at the time of Mary's 1836 arrest? And according to one of the one of the New York City directories of the time, I actually found out that a Black man named William Thompson, probably the same Bill Thompson who's mentioned in 1858, was living at 108 Green Street at the time of Mary's arrest, which made me think, like, is he the one who's running this brothel? Did he know, clearly he must have known about Mary's gender identity. And clearly, if she remains in contact with him after her arrest and imprisonment in 1836, he clearly didn't have a problem with it. So I think this particular case, which I was able to find by basically searching newspapers.com for 108 Green Street and William Thompson within a prescribed period of time, I think it would be interesting to go to the municipal archives and see what information is in this court case file. It seems like it would be pretty juicy. It might give some additional names of people who were at 108 Green Street with Mary, maybe people who were in her peer group. I also was able to find, and I apologize for the quality of the image, but I thought this was really interesting as well. This is press coverage of a case of a Black trans feminine person named Sarah Thompson, who was arrested for robbing her landlady just a year before Mary Jones's arrest. So this was in 1835. The boarding house where Sarah Thompson and her landlady lived was at number 55 Renwick Street. And looking into that, that's been a little bit confusing because apparently number 55 Renwick Street didn't exist at this point in time, so it may have been a typo. I did find the name of Mrs. Lozier in the New York City directory of 1835, living at a number 45 Renwick Street. And I think it's interesting that 45 Renwick Street is so close to the 108 Green Street, 72 Sullivan Street, the areas where Mary would have been, we know that Mary would have been living. So, I mean, best case scenario, this person, Sarah Thompson / Peter Thompson, could possibly be Mary Jones. Worst case scenario, another Black trans woman is living in the exact same neighborhood as Mary Jones at the exact same time, which again makes me think there's something communal going on here. And I think that the records, if investigated thoroughly enough and with all of this information in mind, could probably tell us a lot about what this community looked like and who was involved. So these next slides speak a little bit to network possibilities beyond New York City. So New Orleans comes up a lot in Mary Jones's case. In 1836, she says that she attended balls among the people of her own color in New Orleans, dressed in feminine attire, and it was never a problem. In 1848, she claims that her husband was on a trading trip to New Orleans. And I do think it's interesting because now we do know that Mary does fudge some of the details of her life. She claims to be in her 20s in 1848, and we know that's probably not true. She gives her a different name, a different feminine alias, quote unquote, than Mary Jones at that time. So it is definitely possible that she never traveled to New Orleans, but my question, of course, is why did she mention New Orleans? What is it about New Orleans that clicked to her to mention in relation to these arrests in which she's really being sort of scrutinized for her gender identity? So I looked on this database of runaway slave advertisements. It's called Freedom on the Move, and it's keyword searchable, which is amazing. And I tried to see if I could find examples from the 1830s and 40s of Black trans people or people who seem to fit the way in which I'm thinking of like Black trans identity at the time. And I found these two really interesting cases. One is the case of Mariah from 1837. And it says here that she will probably try to pass herself off as a hairdresser or as a boy, as she has frequently dressed herself in boys' clothes and has her hair cut short for this purpose. Now, I thought this was interesting because it is a well-known fact that a lot of enslaved people, while trying to self-emancipate, would cross-dress in order to avoid detection. But this just feels different. It seems like it's more than that. It doesn't say that, you know, she dressed in boys' clothes and she cut her hair short, you know, to avoid detection or for the purpose of running away. It connects this masculine gender presentation to something that she has done frequently prior to self-emancipation. So I thought that was really interesting, especially in light of this. So this is an advertisement from 1848. And it talks about an enslaved person named Brazil. Brazil ran away last July, so I guess, July of 1848, and was seen dressed in women's clothes several times in the city. Also wearing genteel male apparel. That's something that people also said of Mary Jones, that when she wasn't wearing women's attire, she would be wearing genteel male clothing. And it also says here that Brazil was a regular attendant of the balls. So that is really the first non-Mary Jones related piece of documentary evidence I've been able to find of specifically balls in which Black people were attending, quote unquote, cross-dressed or expressing themselves in a way that was believed to be contrary to their birth sex or anatomy. I've been trying to find more information about Brazil, about the people who enslaved Brazil. I haven't found a ton. But I'm hoping that looking more into maybe where Brazil was enslaved might give some information about where to look for these balls. Where were they happening? Who was hosting them? And from there, maybe getting some more information on how Mary could have either participated in them or heard about them from people who did. This is the Sing Sing prison admission register. So to me, this is interesting because it gives Mary's place of birth not as New York, which is what was stated in the 1836 arraignment interview, not as New Jersey, which is what she said in the 1848 arraignment interview, but as the West Indies. This is not the only time this discrepancy appears in Mary Jones's documentary history. We also see it here in her marriage record to Betsy Williams. You can see it says spouse's birthday. That would have been Betsy Williams's birthday, I'm sorry. Spouse's birthplace. You can see that is Betsy Williams being born in New Jersey. Perhaps that's where Mary Jones got that from for 1848, who knows? But it gives Mary Jones's birthplace as the West Indies. This is interesting to me because there is a lot of research being done right now about Black gender nonconformity and West Indian culture, Caribbean culture. A lot of it stems from looking into the various roots of carnival celebrations, also looking into the sort of spiritual aspects of gender crossing, looking into the African antecedents of these practices. And a lot of it is centered around the Black experience in the West Indies, usually in a colonial context. So this particular slide is interesting to me because it kind of, let me see, I'm still sort of looking into this particular aspect. It's something that I've found very, very recently. So I haven't really figured out how to articulate it yet, but the potential tie between the Black community in New Orleans, the Black community in the West Indies, and the Black community in West and Central Africa, and this sort of thorough line of gender crossing, and specifically of trans feminine identities, is very interesting to me. So it's not saying, of course, that, someone who is fulfilling this spiritual role of a Kimbanda in Angola in the 1600s is the same as, someone cross-dressing for carnival in Jamaica in the 1830s, or as Mary Jones expressing her gender identity in the 1840s in New York or in New Orleans. But I just can't shake the feeling that there is something connecting all of this. And I want to do as much research as I can to sort of identify what that connection is and what it means for, someone like Mary Jones, who risked a lot to stay in her community, and what her reasoning for that may have been, where their acceptance came from, what was it based in. And yeah, this is going to be the last slide. This actually comes from an article that I found like last week, and it is amazing. The story of Victoria reminded me so much of Mary's story, despite it being, I don't even know, like 300 years before Mary's. Just the idea of this trans feminine person being sort of subject to this, carceral system, being forced to, being put in a position where she has to answer to, how does your anatomical sex conflict with the way you're dressing? And the first thing that she references is her community, that, not only is she justified in dressing this way, she's justified in dressing this way because there's a whole group of people just like her who are doing the exact same thing. And they're her people. They're people from, they're other Black people. They're people from her homeland. I just find all of this extremely fascinating, and I know that there is more to learn. Yeah, and that's it. Thank you guys so much.
All right, great. I guess I'll jump in with some of the questions that have been inputted. The first question is from Helena. She asks, is there any further information you've found in the historical record relating to the prosthetic Mary was wearing in the original arrest report? It's a fascinating detail.
Absolutely. So historical trans prosthetics is also kind of like a side special interest of mine. I've done a lot of research into like trans mask prosthetics that were used in like the 18th century. I haven't found a lot of reference to trans feminine prosthetics, but I mean, obviously, like if trans mask ones existed, trans femme ones existed. I did find some 1840s newspaper articles, and I couldn't really tell like what level of truth they contained, where it talked about a young man being deceived by his friend group who equipped a guy in the group with this vaginal prosthetic and, had him, pretend to be interested in this friend, and they like hooked up, and it was this whole thing. But again, I'm thinking, if this is the kind of information that is available in a public tabloid. That just doesn't come out of nowhere. Someone was probably doing something very similar, if not that exact thing.
Yeah. And then our next question is from Mary Ann. Was she free when living in New York City or escaped?
Yeah, so that's actually a really fascinating question. And the truth is, I don't know. So I know that emancipation in New York happens in 1827. If Mary is born in 1803, then it is very possible that she lived part of her life enslaved. It could explain why it's so difficult to find any information about anyone who has the last name of Sewali prior to the 1830s. I've looked all over ancestry.com, different states. That name is just nowhere. So I was thinking maybe it is an anglicization of a French name, possibly. Could it be that maybe her family was from the West Indies? Maybe they were part of that wave of enslaved people who were brought to places like New York and New Orleans when the Haitian Revolution broke out. That's kind of a theory that I've been trying to throw around in my head for a while. But yeah, I definitely need some more information about that.
That's also something that I was wondering. Like, I always thought that she would probably be born in New York or in the South and escaped. And when you mentioned that she was born in the West Indies, I was like, interesting, because that is like, there's like a gap in that history.
Yeah.
All right. Our next question is a little long, so it might take me a while to read it. But it says, I was intrigued by your note that white men would often dress as Indians when committing crimes, like throwing tea into the Boston Harbor. What was the basis, in your opinion, in creating the law against masquerading in New York City? Were there any cases where prosecution applied to white individuals in the same time period of Mary? What was the extent of their prosecution? Is there something you might want to pursue in your research? And I can read those questions over again if you need me
No,
to.
no, that's great. So I actually only very recently, like within the last couple of months, made that connection between the pace, the punishing pace of Mary's arrests and the implementation of that 1840s masquerade law. Um, so I don't know a lot about it. I do know that around the time the law was passed, um, I think in upstate New York, there was something called like um, something to do with farmers' rents, and a law enforcement officer was actually killed in those riots. And I know I've seen some newspaper articles about white male cross-dressed farmers in Indian disguises um, being tried for that murder, and people being very concerned that this was a practice that was going to spread to other places where riots were common. But I think that would be a great thing to look into for sure. I feel like there's a lot there. And yeah, I think, side note, the reason why I made the connection is because I was hearing about the mask mandate having been the impetus for those masquerade laws to finally be discontinued in New York. So they had a really long run, and they influenced a lot of the oppression that queer and trans people have faced since their implementation in New York. And it seems like there are some arguments for bringing them back, because people don't like the idea that protesters can be masked and be obscuring their identities from law enforcement. There's a huge backlash against the mask mandate in spite of the ongoing COVID situation. And so it's all like very current stuff. So I did think that was really interesting.
Also, she's wondering about if you have any thoughts on Mary's marriage life later on. And then her wife seems to have been a lot younger.
Hmm. It's true. So I did think it was interesting that Mary gets married so late in life. I know it's something that people that I shared Mary's story with found really surprising. Um, a lot of the early research on Mary kind of framed her as a homosexual man. And so the idea of her, marrying this woman so late in life, it kind of sort of paralleled a lot of those experiences of like older gay men who have faced a lot of oppression for their orientation, going back in the closet, marrying a woman, trying to sort of hide uh, out of necessity who they are. And I found it interesting because I'm like, on the surface, those parallels, you could argue for some of those parallels, but again, it does kind of seem different, because Mary doesn't stop wearing feminine apparel. She doesn't stop, going out on I think at the time they called it, which is kind of cool, like the cruise. She continues to do what she always did. So I'm wondering, like, not only where did she meet this woman, but was this woman also involved in sex work? Did they bond in that way? I know there's been some research on relationships between um, uh, female sex workers and whether or not those relationships can or should be interpreted as lesbian relationships. And I think that would be really interesting to think about in Mary's case. It's definitely something I feel gets overlooked a lot, the idea that trans people in history could, well, not all of them were straight. Some of them were also probably queer. So it's not always this idea of like, was this person trans or were they gay? Some people were probably both. And I think that, yeah, thinking about Mary having like a potentially, lesbian relationship is like super cool. So next step is definitely to learn as much about Betsy as possible.
And
Um,
then before I jump to the next question, a comment that was in the chat was someone said that they were wondering if this was probably also a marriage of convenience, just because Betsy probably needed to have certain rights, and to get those rights, she needed to be married.
that is true. That is true. I'm thinking too of like the degree of protection just in general it could offer someone being married to um, someone who is legally a
Mhm.
man. Um, but I do wonder like how much that would have extended in Mary's case because it seems like she was so well known uh, as a yeah, I mean, like I guess this is like the tension that keeps like cropping up in this case. And
Mhm.
it's interesting because it is something that I feel like is part and parcel of a lot of trans discourse today. This idea that, a trans woman has some sort of male privilege. And it's kind of like, well, in Mary's case, how far did that really get her? It seems like, uh, I mean, first you have the racial element where it's sort of like, is Black male privilege on the same level as white male privilege? No, obviously not. But also it's sort of like, is she even being seen that way? It's like in the carceral context so that she can be further oppressed, then she's seen as a man. Otherwise, she's not really afforded like any of the quote unquote privileges of manhood. Um, so I don't know. That's another thing that I'm still kind of like throwing around in my head in relation to Mary Jones's case. But
Yeah. The next question is, what percent in all groups were trans in the 1840s? Like, is there information like that?
I don't have any information. And I think part of that is that, like, for me, I'm looking at transgender identity as a framework. Like, I have my own opinions about, whether or not people in the past can be described as trans. But in terms of my research relating to Mary Jones, I'm thinking of it more like, um, let's just say that the experiences that Mary faced are very, very similar to the experiences that trans people now are facing.
Mhm.
And with that in mind, me as a trans person, I want to approach the records thinking about things that maybe people who aren't trans wouldn't necessarily think of. So it's not that I'm trying to avoid the question of whether or not Mary is trans. It's more just like, I feel like that is a question that I would want to save until I sort of find as much information as I can. Um, and I guess I have to work a little bit more on, you know, what I'm considering trans, because yeah, I do want to know more about, how many people like Mary were there? I have definitely found a lot, oh my gosh, so many more news articles in that time period, that antebellum time period, about people who I would consider trans, more people than I ever thought I would find, not just Black people, honestly, way more white people than Black people. But yeah, there were a lot of people out there doing a lot of very gender expansive things. And yeah, some statistics would definitely be in order once I kind of get my research together a little more.
Yeah. And then I'm going to combine two questions. They're kind of similar. The first one was West Broadway back then considered a predominantly Black neighborhood? And then kind of pairing to that, do you think maybe there was a community of Black trans people in Lower Manhattan in the 1840s? Maybe they weren't getting arrested, so maybe they weren't getting arrested, so maybe that that's why we only see one or two people mentioned.
Yeah. So that is something that I have not looked into yet. Um, I know that in the 1836 press coverage of her first known arrest, they talk about Mary being well known in the Five Points, especially amongst like the Black, um, I guess, early bars and clubs of that time period, in the Five Points. I know there was a section of the Five Points that was known as being Black geographical space. But as for West Broadway, it's a little bit farther away. I don't know. I would want to look more into it. I think I read something in a book recently, and I can't remember the title of it, where someone mentioned that area being very closely associated with sex work. And I think that had something to do with its proximity to the waterfront. Um, and they did mention race in the context of a lot of the people who worked on the waterfront were Black. So I thought that was interesting, a very interesting connection. I know a lot of people have sort of theorized as to if Mary Jones traveled to New Orleans, how would she get there? How would she be able to travel there and back safely from a free state to a slave state? How would that have even worked? And some people have thought that, well, maybe if she was employed as a sailor and she had the protection of a company or the government, then that would have made travel a little bit easier for her. So that's definitely one thing to look into. But I love that idea of there being a community of Black trans people who are kind of going unnoticed in the carceral archive. Now, I haven't done enough research to say whether or not that's the case. I imagine that if there was a community, it was probably really small. It was probably like, a handful of people, and it was probably padded out by a number of other sort of queer associated people, and also probably sex workers and probably sailors and actors. And there was probably like a lot of like crossover amongst all of these different groups, and they kind of all kind of hung out together. But the idea that they escaped notice and therefore that's why we don't know about them, I think that's very, very pertinent. I know I've seen that a lot when I've been looking at sodomy case files, where the people who get arrested are usually people who are young and haven't had a chance to sort of learn what not to do, where not to go, how to not get caught, or people who are out of towners. So I know a couple of scholars who looked at similar records have sort of posed that theory of we really don't, it's really hard to measure the prevalence of this kind of behavior because, the only people we know about are the people who got caught, and they probably fall into very specific categories. So yeah, I think that would be something to keep in mind for sure.
Great, and let's see if we can get at least 2 more questions in, but this is actually one from a former presenter that we've had, Eric K. Washington. He said, "Great presentation, thank you. Can you say more about the anti-masquerade ordinance? His own research turns up a 1810 masquerade prohibition from the New York City Common Council. Also, are you planning on writing a biography of Mary Jones?"
So first, I did not know about that. I definitely am not as familiar with the New York Masquerade Law as I would like to be. I really wanted to get into not just sort of like the legislation and the reasons for the legislation, but also sort of like um, where do things like masquerade balls fit into that? Because I have seen some coverage in the press of New York masquerade balls, especially in like the French communities of antebellum New York, especially during Mardi Gras. So like how was their legislation sort of framing those events? Was that considered threatening? Yeah, so I would definitely be interested in looking into that 1810 legislation because I wonder if it's tied to that somehow. And I would love to write a biography of Mary Shelley. Writing is not the easiest thing for me. It's something I struggle with a lot. I'm definitely one of those people that's like obsessed with research. And then when it comes time to like write it all down, I'm just like, oh my God. Oh. But I do want to find a way to get Mary's story out to as many people as possible. And yeah, maybe a biography, maybe some sort of digital archival project. yeah, I'm open to all the possibilities.
Okay, great. And Eric said he's happy to share his info. Let's talk.
Oh, amazing. Awesome.
All right, and then one last question because we have 4 more minutes. How do you approach searching for information in historical records about contemporary constructs of gender and race? What search terms are helpful or were helpful?
Okay. So one of the things that I started out doing was, I mean, keyword search is like, I cannot describe how helpful keyword search is. Internet Archive has a keyword search function that has been very helpful to me. I've found that looking up parts of phrases can be very helpful, like putting them in quotation marks and looking up things like in women's attire or in women's clothing has been really, really productive. Then from there, when you start amassing sort of like a number of hits for something sort of intuitive like that, then you can start looking in the individual articles and seeing if there's like repeating language that maybe you wouldn't have thought about, like masquerading, for example, or another word that I've been finding recently in a lot of these not ads, in a lot of these news coverage of gender gender transgression is metamorphosis or in metamorphose. That comes up a lot. What else? Another thing is a lot of times just the way that these different sources have been digitized means that the letters sometimes can be misinterpreted or can be sort of jumbled, and that makes it harder to do keyword searches. But it doesn't seem like numbers have that same level of difficulty. So if there's an address, like if you're finding an article that says like a bunch of people who were quote unquote cross-dressed were arrested at blah, blah, blah place, and they're giving you an address and you want to know like what's going on with this place. Even if it gives names of those individuals, it might be more productive to start with looking at the address, just because the numbers probably will turn up more easily in a keyword search than letters. Or if someone has a very, very identifiable name, a very specific name, that can also be super helpful as well.
Okay, great. So thank you all for attending this month's Lunch and Learn, and thank you, Riah, for sharing the story of Mary Jones. It's stories such as these that really help us to recognize the presence of marginalized communities in private and municipal archives. So thank you so much. We're extremely grateful to hear your research and definitely excited to see where it goes as you continue to do your research. There are a few links that have been posted in the chat that just provide more information on Riah's work and his blog post, as well as information on the Department of Records and our upcoming events. So feel free to check all of those links out. And thank you again for attending today's program. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you all so much.